Hi, I'm Jared Morgenstern with Connections in Recovery, New York. Today I'll be speaking with Jamie Vinck, who's the CEO of Sierra Tucson, which is an addiction and behavioral health treatment center. I'm really excited to speak with Jamie. Jamie is deeply focused on supporting staff by addressing compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and developing resiliency in her organization. So I think this is a really important conversation, not just for mental health and addiction providers, but for anyone who's in any kind of system that is stressful, that requires a lot of their time and a lot of their energy, which is most of us. I hope you enjoy it. Please leave a question or comment below, and please subscribe. Thank you. Hi, Jamie. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it. I wanted to start with what brought you to Sierra Tucson, and what do you enjoy about working at an inpatient treatment center?
Okay, well, that's a great question.
It's a big question.
That is a big question. So being a licensed professional counselor has been a career change for me. I was in the business world for 10 years before that. And now that I am an LPC, or as soon as I became an LPC, I would like to say that addictions work found me, or I found it, and I've been in the residential business ever since. What I find about residential treatment is that the clients, the patients, they come to us in their darkest moment, and it is the dark night of the soul. And we are there, and we are able to stand with them in that moment, and through 30 days or even less, witness a transformation where they begin to have hope, and we get to be part of that installation of hope, not just for them, but for the people that love them as well. And so I fell in love with residential treatment, and I've been able to utilize my business skills and in combination with my clinical skills.
It's really powerful to hear. I think that a lot of people don't understand how intense the work is at an inpatient level. That because I think there's some sense that, well, it kind of leaves some of the stress of the world behind, right? But that really creates this room for the deeper work, right? The clearing work, right? Where now you're here and it's intense, and I'm wondering how you support staff who are working with such complicated cases. How do we understand what we call compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma that they might experience in that setting?
That's a great question, and I believe the first and foremost important point is that those of us in leadership at Sierra Tucson, we've been there. I have a lot of empathy for what a primary therapist experiences, what a family therapist experiences. I've been there, I've done the job. Our chief medical officer has been the floor psychiatrist in an inpatient behavioral health psychiatric stabilization facility. So we know, and so we are attuned, and we are empathetic for what the stressors that they feel, and so we can support healthy coping strategies.
You've really, you do trainings around the country. You have made it a central focus, right, of your work to address burnout, to address compassion fatigue, and the vicarious trauma that clinicians experience, that workers, not just clinicians, workers experience. So can you define for us what compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma are?
The definition that I prefer in the research that I work with is Dr. Figley, and he defined compassion fatigue as the combination of secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, and burnout. And each one of these components has various manifestations, but compassion fatigue can most easily be understood as when the cup is empty. There is no more to give, that feeling of complete exhaustion and depletion. And I believe we've all been there. And it's in that moment that as providers, we are the most vulnerable for unhealthy coping strategies, maladaptive coping strategies. It's also interesting that those of us that have experienced the most trauma in our lives and have the most empathy are at risk, are at the most risk for compassion fatigue, which I've always found rather ironic because, in my opinion, that's what made me the best therapist. I had personal trauma and I also had a lot of empathy. And so understanding how to build our own resilience so that we can be present, not just for our clients, but in all our relationships.
That sounds really difficult, I want to say.
It is.
So when you think about the pitfalls, the things that are signs and mistakes that clinicians can make when they're trying to, live their lives in the context of giving really intensive support to people. What do you see? What do you guys notice?
Let me just back up a moment and talk about vicarious trauma.
Please.
Vicarious trauma is not the most horrific thing that one has ever heard. Vicarious trauma is the thousands of things that we've heard. And what ends up happening when we begin to experience vicarious trauma is that it shifts our worldview. There's mild cognitive changes, and we stop seeing the world in which we have, and we notice that we're not ourselves. And as a leader, I feel responsible to watch our employees and notice, that isn't a response that they would typically have. An example and something that happens when we experience compassion fatigue, and I see this more in the vicarious trauma folks, is just jaded.
Yeah, the cynicism effect.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
And I see it when people come into residential and perhaps they've been there 3-4 times. Well, what's going to be different this time? And that's when we have to hit the pause button and to bring someone else in to handle that case that perhaps has more resilience going at that moment. And I'm always watching for it. Something else that I see is that they avoid conflict and they avoid giving bad news. And that's what goes back to what I talked about, where there's just no more to give. The cup is empty and there's nothing on which to draw. And the other thing that I notice as well is that people fall behind in paperwork. And that is the irony. And when I present on compassion fatigue, I talk about ethical pitfalls. And that the best way to take care of ourselves is to have good documentation. Because if our notes aren't up to a standard, then really that's self-destructive.
No, that's really fascinating. I don't think I've ever heard it framed that way. Because I know that there were times in the past when I was working in high-intensity settings, sort of like outpatient triage, like post or pre-hospitalization settings. And the first thing to go is my documentation when I felt overwhelmed. The first thing.
You and everyone else.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I'd be backed up, and that would only add to my stress, and off we would go. Suddenly things would start to feel a little bit more hopeless, and I'd feel a little bit more helpless.
Absolutely.
And I'm really struck by what you were identifying with the kind of jadedness, that cynicism that can really creep into the work. And I would bristle when I wasn't in a position to manage the system, when I was just in the system. I would bristle with colleagues who would kind of give me everybody's a liar. Everybody's a this, you know that state. Everybody, they're just manipulative. Everything is negative. And I would really have a response to that, like, where is the hope, or where is the compassion? Where is the sense that this is an experience that they're in and we're with them, But it's true when you are empty, or when you have 1,000 cuts of traumatic experiences that you've held. It's hard to sit there fully intact and be present. It's very, very powerful.
Absolutely, and that's where we get to draw on our own resilience and to understand how to build our provider resilience and how to be able to self-soothe and self-confront simultaneously. And if we can't do it, then have someone that can support us in doing it.
Right. And so what are some of the social pitfalls then? Because you're identifying really a social need. So what are some of the pitfalls that providers should be noticing to help them identify if they're in one of these states?
And this can be true with secondary traumatic stress. It can be true for vicarious trauma, and it certainly is true with compassion fatigue, that we notice our world just gets a little bit smaller, and that our primary relationships tend to go on the back burner, and that we over-identify with our clients, and that we find ourselves immersed in their world, and that we cannot enjoy normal activities that we usually used to enjoy, and that we notice that when we come home, we hit the couch, we turn on Netflix, rather than engaging with people outside of the behavioral health world. A little tell on myself is I notice when my compassion fatigue monitor is up is when I won't interact with people other than other behavioral health professionals. And my husband, who is not in the business, will arrange some sort of couples night or interaction with friends of his, and I find myself judging other people, thinking, oh, you're playing golf, I'm saving the world. I need to get back to people that get it, people that are really engaged in life. And then I have to step out and say, time out, so judgmental, so unfair. And to really come back down and to look at what's happening there. Why am I so isolated? And why is my only value on this one segment of the population?
Absolutely. I completely relate. I absolutely could tell on myself 1,000 times over of really bringing work home with me, really kind of, not connecting with my partner and it being reflected to me that I wasn't connecting, and really having to challenge myself and say, what am I doing right now? Like, what is this about? And it is about kind of the need to control, right? Because I'm actually exhausted. I'm actually really tired.
Exactly.
And so when you talk about resiliency, which I think I don't hear that a lot in terms of staff, in terms of workers. I hear it a lot in terms of clients, but I don't hear a lot about like worker resiliency. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you understand that?
Absolutely. A couple of years ago, I was honored to go to Airman Resilience training at the United States Air Force, and honestly, the armed forces are really learning a lot more about resiliency, and the Air Force hosts several different trainings, and I was part of one. And what they found is that on their base in San Antonio, Texas, there had been 80 suicides in 1 year, and they understood the ripple effect, the ramifications of how many of the folks that called that base their home had been negatively impacted by these great tragedies. And so they began to train in resiliency. And what we found, they have this provider resilience app, and I highly recommend downloading it. And it utilizes the ProQual, which is the evaluation of 3 psychometrics, and one is burnout, the other one is secondary traumatic stress, and the third is compassion satisfaction. Now there comes the hope, the compassion satisfaction, because we all do this for a reason, and let's face it, we all get something out of it or we wouldn't be doing it.
Absolutely.
And either on a primary gain or a secondary gain level. And so this app holds us accountable to ourselves. And it asks us a number of questions daily, such as, how many days since your last vacation? How are you feeling in terms of your workload? And then the compassion satisfaction, measuring how do we feel about the people with whom we work? How do we feel about our set and setting? How do we feel about our residents? Those kinds of things. And then it gives us a score. And then the app also has tools, affirmations, and then it holds us accountable in the ways such as, did you get up and walk?
Right.
It's time now to go move around, to take a breath, to go exercise, that sort of thing.
That's brilliant. I had no idea that existed until you told me about it, and I'm just so curious as to why so many systems don't implement these tools. right? Like, why not implement it? What do you think the resistance is in larger systems to implementing a real deep understanding of compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and what was the third? The
Secondary
traumatic stress. What do you think the resistance is?
I don't even know that it's resistance. I think people simply don't understand, and we're moving so fast, and we are having so many things thrown at us right now in our industry. The opioid epidemic and the crisis of people dying by suicide. I am just completely overwhelmed by that. And so I believe that there's so many things coming at us in our business is that we're not taking the time. And let's face it, there's a lot of funding issues. And I'm so blessed to work for an organization that allows me the time and space to research these things, to create presentations, and to share them. And at Sierra Tucson, we have healing groups where there are a small group of us. We'll journal, we'll share things with each other, and it's a very diverse group. And so we put them together in a meaningful way.
It's incredible the investment that's been made, and it's more than just a monetary investment, although it is financial, right? Because you have to carve time out for people to engage in these things, but it's an investment in people's health. It's a person investment. Why should a parent or a person who might be curious about treatment watching, why should they care if an organization implements any kind of resiliency policy?
The main reason I would say is because it's so important that the person that is interacting with your loved one at every level, the person that's greeting them at the door, the person that's helping them with their luggage, placing them in the room, if they're not healthy, if they're not present, if they have had a cognitive worldview that has shifted and they're cynical, if they're wondering within the privacy of their own soul, oh my gosh, did I make the right decision to be here? Do I have anything more to give? Or take it one step further, what if they've started drinking too much?
Right.
In their off hours, what if they're suffering from untreated depression? What if they're fighting with their wife all the time because they think everybody else is pointless?
Right.
It goes on and on and on. And so I feel compelled to be sure that all employees are bringing their best selves to work. And so that's why it would be important to me.
It's wildly important. I'm really struck by this conversation in particular. I think that a lot of times we look out in this field.
Yes.
We look out. We are not doing necessarily the systems work within these different organizations to be thoughtful and considerate of how living people, are taking care of themselves. This is so essential.
Absolutely.
It's kind of, I think, an important, I don't want to say revolutionary because I don't think it should be, but it may be the kind of step that needs to be taken in many industries where people are working a lot more, productivity is always moving up, right? Not necessarily making a lot more money. Right. And rarely. And I think really experiencing a lot of mental health issues. We could get in front of some of that if businesses invested in resiliency.
Absolutely. And, I just wanted to go back to our own ethical pitfalls as well. We talked a bit about documentation, but something that is really important is the notion of boundary violations and dual relationships. And any licensed provider gets to be mindful of that at all times. And when we're exhausted, we might be more vulnerable to a self-disclosure that doesn't really benefit the patient. Yep. If we're depressed, I've seen that in clinicians over and over again. Why did you just disclose that? Because they're exhausted and they're depressed and it felt good to make it about them for a minute. Not okay.
Right.
The other thing is dual relationships. And organizations are vulnerable for dual relationships at every level. And if a tech is feeling bitter, burnt out, like they're not getting their fair share, they might be more inclined to go and enter into a dual relationship with one of the residents that's not okay. So the ethical pitfall, I really get to reinforce that over and over again, and we can And when we're at our best, that's when we're able to combat that.
I'm so glad you're in the position you're in to be thinking about these things and shaping an organization with these concepts at the core of the way that you are approaching the work with your employees, which is so incredible. More broadly, how do you understand the word recovery? What does it mean to you? And you can speak organizationally if you prefer. How do you see recovery in clients that come to you? What is it that you guys are looking for?
Sierra Tucson is a thought leader in providing integrative care. And I believe that integrative care is treating the whole person, mind, body, spirit, and looking at them as a divine human rather than a diagnosis. And part of that integrative care means their relationships as well. I put that in with the spirit. And to me, recovery is to look at an individual in those key components and to say, there's been forward movement. They feel a little better physically. They've got some energy. They're sleeping okay. The spirit piece, they are connected to something. And they're able to communicate in a healthy manner with their loved ones, with their primary relationships. And then the mind, there's a myriad of things that we think about with that. And as long as there's healing, then I believe that that's recovery. It's important to note that residential treatment is the ticket to the movie. It's not the movie. And no one's fixed in 30 days. I wish they were.
Right.
But that continued care, when someone says, yes, I will continue my work, to me, that's recovery.
Awesome. That's a great definition, by the way. I've really been, one of the phrases that keeps coming up in terms of a conversation around recovery is connection. People talk about connection a lot. So it's interesting that keeps coming up in these conversations. So what are you reading or watching or experiencing that inspires you right now?
I've been doing a lot of reading personally on Queen Victoria.
Really?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a British history buff, and she is just an inspirational figure to me. And they ask in resiliency training, I know I keep going back to that, but it's very important to me, who's your resiliency role model? And when I do these talks, I'll ask people, who do you think, who's your resiliency role model? And I'm finding that for myself, I'll go out and I'll find new resiliency role models for myself from different eras. And the thing that resonates with me about Victoria is that she wore black for 40 years in mourning for her beloved Prince Albert. And so there's that sort of thing. I mean, it's not to look at historical figures that have had heartache. Alexander Hamilton was my last one, George Washington.
Right.
So I tend to just focus on my own resiliency role models.
No, that's fascinating. I love that. And I hope anybody that's watching takes some time to think about, who would their resiliency role model be? I love that question. All right, so how could someone watching or listening learn more about the services you guys provide?
We have a very comprehensive and informative website, www.sierratucson.com.
Great.
And when you click on the website, someone from our admissions team will pop up and ask if there's any questions that they can answer.
That's incredible. And we'll put that in the information below, and we'll also put a contact number so they can reach out to get support.
Thank you.
And I also want to say that having spoken with you guys before, you'll help people even if you're not the right fit. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Being part of Acadia, where we have a number of facilities, and we have something that will meet everyone's needs from a treatment standpoint and also from a financial standpoint.
Great.
So please just reach out. I had one more thing I wanted to add on connection,
Please.
if that's okay.
Of course.
You use the word connection, and that is so important. And at Sierra Tucson, we have a program called Connect 365, and we stay in touch with all of our residents weekly for a year, and we give them an app too. I'm all about the app. And the app has been created to mirror what happens in treatment to facilitate the cognitive restructuring. And they have a recovery coach that they meet while in treatment. And we're having really fabulous results with that connection. That's offered at no additional cost, and that's our commitment to our residents that we will stay with them for a year.
Yeah, I think transitional care is incredibly meaningful and important, and is kind of like our entire model, right? It's that people when they're having any kind of meaningful transition need support. So I think that's really smart. I think that's great. Thank you.
And when you asked about recovery, when someone signs up for Connect 365, I look at that as an important step toward recovery. Something's working, yay.
Jamie, thank you so much for coming today and speaking. I always love speaking with you, and I'm really glad we had an opportunity to share some of your knowledge with the people that are going to watch.
Thank you.
Thanks again.